We're now going to turn our attention to the antebellum South, the years between 1830s and 1850s outside of the North and the West. The South developed much differently than the North, as you already know. It had its roots going all the way back to the colonial colonization. By the antebellum age, most Southerners remained small farmers, but the economy and society continued to be dominated by the large slaveholding plantation elites. The development of this plantation economy in the colonial era, including the development of slavery on which it depended, are covered in other videos. The nature of slavery during the antebellum age, including slave life and resistance, as well as free African Americans, are also covered in other videos. Here we will explore more specifically the period from 1830s through the 1850s, but much of the material covered earlier still applies, and the information here is kind of supplemental. This is because the industrial changes sweeping the North during the antebellum age did not take root as much in the South. In the antebellum age, the Southern economy expanded like the Northern economy, but it did not change like the Northern economy. Southern society remained largely stagnant. Just as in the colonial and early national eras, plantations remained complex and largely self-sufficient operations. Besides their residences, plantations might include carriage houses, blacksmith shops, schoolhouses, offices, churches, commissary stores, grist mills, and sawmills, among others. Given the advances in transportation, plantations were not as dependent upon an individual plantation wharf or river as before, but rather they shipped their staple crops to the nearest town, railroad, or wharf during the antebellum age. Unlike in the earlier period, most antebellum plantations did not have the elaborate owner's mansion that you think of. Often owners in the antebellum age were absentee landowners. For those that did construct the large mansions, the popular styles are no longer Georgian as much as French colonial, which is shown in the bottom left here, and Greek revival in the bottom right. As the northern, more industrial and urban economy spread westward in antebellum age, as I've talked about, the southern plantation economy went westward as well. And the reason for that, of course, was something we've talked about earlier, Eli Whitney and the growth of the cotton as an export staple. But I want to go back and sort of reiterate why cotton was the key to the spread of plantation economy in the antebellum age. The great plantation culture of the South was suffering as the late 18th century came to an end. As the late 1700s, tobacco prices had dropped and the boom was long since past. And the tobacco crop kind of ravished the soil of the South. While people may have wanted to grow more rice and indigo further south, that these crops had to be near the tidewater and they couldn't grow westward into the Piedmont. So Southerners at that time, they saw cotton as an alternative. It was great for the textile industry that first was grown in Great Britain and of course later in the North. But there were problems. Now long staple or Sea Island cotton, shown here, was the best for the textiles, but like indigo and rice, it had to be in moist soil, and that meant it could only be grown near the coast. Now, as the late 1700s were around, the plantation owners knew that there was another type of cotton that could be grown away from the coast. It's known as short staple cotton, which you can see here. It had been grown in the South as far back as Jamestown, but it was never really a good staple crop, and that's because its green seeds stayed entangled in the lint, and they had to be picked out by hand. It took one person almost a day to clean out a pound of this short staple cotton compared to 25 pounds one person could clean out in the long staple cotton. And with all the growing demand from the textile industries, so, they really needed so much more cotton. And despite that this, drove cotton prices up, you still needed slaves to pick out the short cotton, staple cotton. It was still not cost efficient despite the rising prices. What saved the southern plantation economy in the late 18th century and ensured that it would spread westward in the antebellum age was somebody we've mentioned before, Eli Whitney, a mechanic and graduate of Yale College who was in Georgia teaching and would invent a product that revolutionized the South. Of course, Eli Whitney invented the cotton engine, or as it became known as the cotton gin. It became a quick and cost-effective way to clean the seeds out of short staple cotton. The cotton gin appears to us kind of simple today. Cotton was placed in a hopper, one side of which was slated to permit wire teeth to pull through the cotton lint, but small enough to exclude the seeds. The wires were mounted on a roller driven by a hand crank. A second roller turned in the opposite directions and continually cleaned the wire teeth. The original cotton gin could clean, or gin as they'd say, about 50 pounds of short staple cotton a day. Whitney patented his machine, but because his design was so simple, soon everybody copied it. And Whitney tried, but never became as wealthy as he probably should have and as famous as he is in history. So with Eli Whitney's cotton gin, the big growers in the late 19th century now had what they needed to grow cotton further inland in a cost-effective way. And that's going to allow the plantation economy to spread southwest throughout the antebellum age. The soil of the Southwest was a rich black or brown loam capable of producing cotton for almost a generation without a significant depletion of the soil. Since only about 6.5 months of frostless temperatures and about 25 inches of rain were needed each year to grow short staple cotton, by 1850 there was a so-called cotton belt that reached from the southern border of Virginia to northern Florida and as far west as Texas. Here you can see a map of the cotton production in 1820 on the top, and also you can see the cotton production in 1860 at the end of the antebellum age on the bottom. Well, the cotton gin made it easier to separate the seeds and twigs from the valuable lint, and thus made cotton production more profitable. It also ensured, rather depressingly, that slavery spread to the Southwest as well as the cotton. Cotton production, after all, still required a lot of labor to grow, tend, and pick the cotton. Some scholars have noted that until the spread of cotton southwest, maybe slavery would have died out. They showed that in the upper South, the Chesapeake region, the price of slaves was dropping early on. Now, if this were true, of course, the Civil War might not have been as necessary, or if it did take place, as bloody. After a banking and financial panic in 1837 resulting from Jackson's specie circular, which I've discussed in earlier videos, cotton prices continued to rise from 5 cents a pound to an average of 11 cents a pound throughout the 1850s. Planters scrambled to put every available acreage into cotton production. They virtually set records every year. As a result, the price of slaves nearly doubled throughout the 1850s. So this is going to make slavery profitable as part of the cotton production. Here you can see a map of the spread of slavery from the late 18th century, 1790 on top, to the late antebellum age in 1860 on the bottom. The darker the color, the more higher the density of slaves, and clearly you can see it growing westward in the antebellum age all the way to Texas. We're going to talk a little more about the development of the slave trade, domestic slave trade, and the growth of an illegal international slave trade during the antebellum age in the next video. The spread of cotton southwest in the antebellum age meant the spread of plantation economy inland, as I say, but it also made market towns more needed in the antebellum age. I've already said that you do see the growth of southern towns, but these towns that grew were still influenced by the plantation-based economy. They did not develop as much as the free market diverse manufacturing cities that grew in northern towns at the same time that we've already covered. Now, the largest of the southern cities was, of course, New Orleans, which by the end of the antebellum age had grown to almost 170,000 people, and that dwarfed all other southern cities that would join the Confederacy in the Civil War. In fact, it was the sixth largest city in the U.S. at the time. After New Orleans, the cities dropped in size tremendously. Charleston, shown on the left, and Richmond, shown on the right, both had about 40,000 people at the end of the antebellum age. That made Charleston the 22nd largest city in the United States, and Richmond the 25th largest city at the time. Outside of these three, only Mobile, Memphis, and Savannah had populations above 20,000 people. These towns were important as marketplaces for slaves and as a place to work out the logistics of the sale of nearby cotton to markets abroad. The towns lacked banks or other financial institutions and were dominated by people called factors, and depicted here. The factor was kind of a merchant middleman between the plantation owner and the textile factory owner abroad. The factor was paid by commission on the value of business he transacted. The factor would advance credit to the planter with future crops as collateral and functioned as the planter's purchasing agent to obtain consumer goods from abroad. While factors at first, early in the antebellum age, worked with London manufacturers, later they were working more with northern manufacturers. In fact, while factors lived in these southern towns, most were indeed northerners. The factor would take charge of a planter's crop when it reached the town, and he would take care of the storage facilities and arrange things like insurance. The factor's commissions were quite high. They did really well, as much as 20% of the value of the crop. And as a result, what you're seeing is a lot of the profits from the southern economy flew out of the south and went north or abroad. The money was not reinvested in the southern towns or the southern economy. Scholars have estimated that the factor system drained between $100 to $150 million annually from the southern economy. What profits were reinvested in the cities? These cities were still growing. You know, the economy that got these invested funds were they lacked diversity. Southerners still had to buy their manufactured items from the north or abroad. While per capita manufacturing in the South nearly doubled during the antebellum age, the South's share of the nation's manufacturing actually declined. Many operators of businesses increasingly complained that they could not get the products they needed locally. You know, in a way, you can see all this, that during the antebellum age, the Southern economy was indeed growing, but as I've said before, not developing, not modernizing. At the end of the antebellum age, the percentage of people employed in agricultural labor was the same as it had been in the 1830s. The Southern whites' per capita wealth at the end of the antebellum age, about $4,000, was nearly double that of the North, about $2,000. With only 30% of the nation's free population, the South had 60% of the nation's wealthiest men. But the takeaway, the value of the slaves, however, and per capita Southern wealth was more than 1/4 of that of the North. Simply put, the wealth was concentrated in the hands of a few elite and was largely based on the value of slaves. Southerners were, of course, aware that their region of the country was different, so less modern or developed, and they reacted in a number of ways. A minority wanted to encourage their own manufacturing and finance as a matter of regional pride, and they formed something called the Southern Commercial Convention. Here you can see a resolution of the Southern Commercial Convention. It had been first founded in the early national era, but it died out, but it was then revived in 1852. The Southern Commercial Convention sought to promote construction of canals, railroads, banks, port facilities, and factories, and it tried to get Southerners to buy only Southern-made products. A South Carolina man named William Gregg decided to build a textile factory in Graniteville, South Carolina, that would, he hoped, serve as a model for other Southerners. Unfortunately, Gregg's factory was not successful, and the Southern Commercial Convention, which had invested so heavily in it, didn't do well as a result. I should note in passing, however, that one Southern senator appeared in nothing but suits made from Gregg's factory. Most Southerners, however, came to view Southern society and culture as sort of unique and better than the North. The South stressed living, leisurely and with hospitality and graciousness. Some have suggested even that Southern hospitality was a result of the relatively isolated plantations. And so you travelers, if they're going to white travelers, when they had there was no inn, so they would just stop by and ask to spend the night, and that they would bring news and so forth, so they were welcomed. So you think of the Southern hospitality there. The South said that the ideal was one of chivalry and honor. And you can see this in the fact that in the antebellum age, there was even the persistence of dueling in the South. That sort of died out in the North. Also, you can see this view of Southern superiority in the way they put their women on a pedestal, stressing chastity and virginity. Southerners, the South insisted, stressed honor towards equals, honesty and kindness towards strangers. It's the North, by contrast, it was seen by Southerners as cutthroat, greedy, dirty, worshiping at the almighty dollar. The North, the South insisted, lacked the grace evident in the Southern plantation class. Cities, the South said in the North, were cesspools of white poverty, crime, and the unhealthy mixing of nationalities and races. It might seem rather ironic that the majority of Southern whites bought into this view of the South when they were not themselves large plantation owners. It appears ironic that as the plantation economy and society dominated the antebellum South, there remained in 1860 only approximately 400,000 rather, slave owners out of a total white population of approximately 8 million. Moreover, even among the slave owners themselves, 88% of the owners held less than 20 slaves. The remaining 12%, however, owned hundreds of slaves and the majority of wealth. These plantation elites had economic, social, and political influence way beyond their actual numbers suggested. So it is kind of ironic that these poor whites would buy into this view of the South when they toiled so hard. There's reasons why these small white, homestead type farmers would buy into the large plantation culture view of the South. Certainly, some of the farming whites, they recognized that they had real links to the wealthy plantation owner economy. Many of them sold food products to the nearby staple crop plantations, and they didn't want to lose customers. Also, given traditional patterns of kinship in the South, a non-slave holding white might quite literally be a distant relative of a wealthy plantation owner nearby. Certainly, many poor whites hope to someday join the plantation elite and work their entire lives to try to fulfill that dream. If the plantation economy ended, they had no hopes or goals and nothing to achieve. In the end, however, only a few non-slave-holding whites actually made it to the minority of plantation elite. Keep in mind as well that in the vein of Southern chivalry, slave-holding planters frequently held open barbecues for the poor white neighbors, and they actively cultivated good relations with the poor whites. Certainly for many of the poorest and worst educated white Southerners, the matter of race mattered most. Feeling put down, they needed someone to make them feel better about themselves. And, they might be poor, but hey, at least they're not black. Keep in mind here that slaves were quite numerous in parts of the South, and slavery meant that blacks were not as much a threat to their own livelihood. In reality, slavery ensured that the poor whites stayed poor by destroying any sense of competition with the wealthier whites. You can see the racism in the fact that starting in the 1830s, there was a popularity of these traveling minstrel shows where the actors wouldn't want to be acting with an African American when there was an African American character to be played, and so they had these white actors that would put on makeup as blackface, and these African American characters were the worst sort of stereotypes. Later on, there was a popular minstrel show in which the main African American character was named Jim Crow, and of course that was the term that came to be applied to African Americans themselves. In any event, this concludes the first of the two videos on the sort of antebellum Southern plantation and economy. The next one will go on and look at the slave trade and hiring out of African Americans.